Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Illumine our hearts, O Master, who lovest mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our mind to the understanding of thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon the spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things as are well pleasing unto thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God. And to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father, who is from everlasting, and thine all holy, good, and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank God we got the slideshow working.
Always a challenge.
It is.
Technology is great when it works. Yes.
So this morning, we're going to continue on with our discussion of Jesus Christ, his life and teaching. We've been talking about Jesus and his disciples for the last several weeks. And today we are going to talk about Jesus and Peter and their relationship in the discipleship of Peter. Excuse me. And our source book says that the strength of the spiritual attraction emanating from Jesus comes through in a series of episodes involving Peter, the apostle mentioned most in the pages of all four of the Gospels. Peter is mentioned in the Gospels under various names: Peter, Simon Peter, Simon itself, and Cephas. A total of 110 times in the Gospels, 75 times in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and 35 times in the Gospel of John. And the arc of the relationship between Jesus and Peter goes through the entire gospel narrative, from the first accounts of the calling of the disciples, which we talked about the last couple of weeks, where Jesus calls Andrew and Peter at the Sea of Galilee while they are fishing, through the story of Peter's denial and his being forgiven by the resurrected Jesus. And actually, in the coming weeks, when we, especially during Holy Week, we will hear these gospel readings about Peter's denial and the forgiveness of Jesus, and that would be after the resurrection. So he goes from Simon to Peter, or Cephas, and we recall that Peter was one of the first to be called, and he headed the list of the 12 apostles. The name Peter, or Cephas, was given to him by Jesus in place of his original name of Simon. Mark mentions this in the connection with the choosing of the 12, and Mark says, Jesus was surnamed, take it back, and Simon, Jesus surnamed Peter. All these names going on. The Gospel of John gives Simon's Aramaic name Cephas, or Kepha, which means both a stone and a rock. And the Greek word Petros is used to translate the Aramaic Cephas, and that also has both these meanings, and that's where we get the word Peter from the Greek and the Latin. In biblical tradition, having a new name changed always bears a special significance. When God changes the person's name, this is a sign that this person has become a servant of God and has entered into a special and new relationship, intimate relationship with God.
Is that why everybody changes their name when they get chrismated here?
I thought about that, and I think that is the thinking behind that. Once you are baptized, you become a new creation. You're born again, and so the church gives you a baptismal name or a chrismation name.
It's like when your soul transfers from one state to another, then it acquires a new name.
Yes, exactly. And so all of us have kind of entered into a more intimate and closer relationship with God when we become baptized or chrismated.
Did you say Peter was forgiven after the resurrection?
Yes, yes, he denies him before,
Before?
and we'll talk about that in detail. And then he is forgiven after Christ is resurrected.
When Jesus says, "Do you love me, Peter? Peter, do you love me?" 3 times he
Yeah.
said, "Yes, I love you, Lord," but over and over. So that was the forgiveness
Right,
without saying, "I forgive you." That's
yes,
how he forgave him.
exactly. Yep. So God changes the names of his chosen ones, those in whom he has shown trust, to whom he has entrusted some mission, with whom he has made a covenant, such as in the case of Abram, who became Abraham, the father of many nations, and his wife Sarai, who became Sarah. And that's the icon here is Abraham and Sarah. And if you've ever wondered why their names were changed, I looked this up, and the name changed from Sarai, which means my princess. The letter I at the end of Semitic words means the first person possessive. And so her name was Sarai, my princess, and it goes to Sarah, which is the generic princess, marked a new identity and the destiny for her. As Sarai, she was unable to have children up to that point, but as Sarah, God promised she would become a mother and progenitor of many nations and, in fact, kings. So this represented a completely new future and purpose in life for her after years of barrenness. The name Sarah reflected this shift in identity and destiny. And so that's what happened with her name. And so I'd had to look that up to figure out what was going on with that. The same thing happened with Abraham. Obviously, he received the name change at the same time from Abram, which means exalted father. Ab is father, and Ram actually in Semitic is the heights. So he went from father of heights to Abraham, father of many nations. Ab is actually Rahim, which is souls. So he became the father of many souls or many nations. And this represented a transition for both of them into the covenant blessings that God intended, a great nation coming from their own child, Isaac. And so going back to your question, Bob, yes, when we get baptized or chrismated, our chrismation name is our new identity. So the other thing, same thing happened with Jacob, who received the name of Israel, which is interpreted as he who struggles or wrestles with God, or in another interpretation, he who sees God after he struggled with God in the form of an angel in the book of Genesis, and God blessed him after that point. So he became known as both Jacob and Israel.
May I interrupt you, Charlie, on that renaming, we'll call it a
Mhm.
new name? Does the church have to approve that name? And it's not going to be, Ariel or, is it usually, it's a saint?
Yes, yes.
Does it have to be a saint? I know it is a saint. Do we know?
I-
Probably.
Yeah, go ahead.
I
if you know.
think, in Romania,
Yeah.
they choose a saint which is around your birthday, and you have, it's like a guardian angel, and you have to pray to that saint to intercede for you, to God to help you throughout all your life.
So it's a
Yes,
saint that
that's,
shares.
that's
birth.
right. And just as another aside, when someone is ordained in the clergy, they are oftentimes given a new name, particularly if they have a secular name, and then they're given a saint name after ordination.
Father Michael was born Brian,
Mhm,
but Father David was born David.
correct.
Yeah, so he kept it.
And I wonder if it's the bishop who actually
Gives that.
gives that indication of whether the name will be changed. For instance, both Deacon Justin and John were Ryan in the secular world.
Right.
And so now they are Justin and John. And I know Deacon John actually chose his ordination name for Saint John Maximovich of San Francisco and Shanghai.
And Subdeacon Nicholas,
Yes,
I
but
think,
his name actually, Coley, is Nicholas in one of these Celtic languages,
oh.
Nikolai.
Nikolai.
Oh,
Correct.
what's that?
Yes, so he actually maintained
I
his name.
see.
But yeah, so again, but like Irina was saying, our saint name is then that's an intercessor for our soul as well. So we enter into a special relationship with them as well. So by giving Peter a new name, Jesus singles him out from among the disciples. The other disciples do not receive this honor with the exception of John and James, to whom Jesus gives the nickname of the sons of thunder. We'll talk about that actually next week. St. John Chrysostom says that the reason Jesus gave new names to 3 of his disciples was to show that it was he who gave the old covenant, that it was he who altered the names, who called Abraham, Abraham, and Sarai, Sarah, and Jacob, Israel. So it's a continual same God who gave the Old Testament names is now giving the New Testament names. So there's a continuity there, no interruption. It's the same God. And so it was these 3 disciples who received new names from Jesus, Peter, James, and John, who were the closest to him over the course of his life. One example would be this icon of the Transfiguration, where only these 3 disciples ascended the Mount of Transfiguration with him and saw that intimate revelation of Jesus' divinity as much as they could bear it. And even that, it was so overwhelming that they fell down on the ground from that. So the question is, who do you say I am? We've been discussing this throughout this whole semester, 2 semesters, and the answer was, you are the Christ. However, Peter is singled out from not only among the 12, but also from among this group of 3. All 3 synoptic gospels contain the account of how Peter confessed Jesus to be the Christ. And Matthew gives the fullest version of Peter's answer when he says, who do you say I am? And Peter answers, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And I was just listening to a podcast today. This is the gospel in a nutshell, that Jesus is the Messiah and he's the Son of God. This is what Jesus came to preach. That's what the gospel preaching is. And this is the first time that this is articulated by the mouth of any apostle or any human being in the Gospels. It's the first time when Peter says this. Why did Peter alone answer Jesus? Well, the answer is found in Matthew's Gospel, and we find the continuation of that story. According to Matthew, after Peter confesses Jesus to be the Christ, Jesus singles him out from among the disciples and responds not to everybody, but to Peter alone. Jesus answered and said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And also I say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades or death shall not prevail against it. And I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven.
Didn't you say Peter means rock?
Yes,
So that's what he means by on this rock.
that's a controversial question. There have been a couple of interpretations. For one thing, is Peter is Petros, and the word rock is actually Petra. So they're 2 separate words in the Greek. And from this text, from the Gospel of Matthew, this plays a big part of the formation of Christian teaching about the church. Okay, in the West, in the Western Church, the Roman Church, the role of Peter as head of the apostolic community is emphasized, and this is passed who then passed on his primacy to the bishops of Rome. And this is where we get the idea of the papacy being, primacy was one thing, first among equals. This continued on to be supremacy of the Pope. And this is where the Orthodox Church would not accept that. The Roman Church took it to the point where the Pope was supreme in all matters of the Church. I won't get into it today, but that's one of the interpretations, Sam, that we don't necessarily hold to.
Was Peter, was he the first pope? Or no?
There is some question about whether he was the first pope. He did not found the church in Rome first. He actually founded the church in Antioch initially. So he was a bishop of Rome at some point, but it was a very short-lived time because he was martyred shortly thereafter, after reaching Rome. So whether he was called Pope or not, I don't know.
So if I was asked a bunch of Catholics, they'd probably say he was.
He probably.
Yeah.
But in reality, I don't even know if the word Pope existed at that time. He was simply the apostle Peter. The apostles then ordained what we would call bishops to follow them. But even then, they weren't called popes or they weren't called patriarchs. They were the overseers, the episcopos of that city, of that church.
So there were multiple, like seven, more than seven then probably. Huh?
Correct.
Seven,
Well,
seven patriarchs.
Five.
yeah, there were originally 5 patriarchates or sees of the church. See would be a geographical area where a bishop oversaw the church's affairs.
Andrew was in Constantinople.
Well, actually, even then, it wasn't Constantinople. It was simply that area of Asia Minor. Mark went to Alexandria.
Egypt.
And then there was James, the brother of the Lord, was the first bishop of Jerusalem. And then Antioch was the other. Constantinople really didn't come into existence until the 4th century when Constantine founded the city.
But Peter was in Rome.
Peter eventually got to Rome. He started out in Antioch. And then he did his missionary journeys as well and eventually ended up in Rome. So, but in the East, this interpretation of thou art Peter and on this rock, another interpretation gained currency according to which the church is built not on Peter himself, but on the belief in the divinity of Jesus Christ, of which Peter's words were a confession. So on this rock of divinity, of faith in Jesus Christ, that's where the church was built on. Okay, and that's what St. John Chrysostom interprets it when he says, he takes the passage, and I say unto thee, thou art Peter, and upon this rock will I build my church. That is on the faith of his confession. And so Peter's confession is confession for the whole group of apostles. And that they then took this confession and established churches everywhere in the world. Okay. And when he says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound, or bind on heaven and on earth and loose in heaven and earth. Well, all the apostles had that ability. So, yeah. Go
I
ahead.
wonder about the translation of some of the words, probably the rock, the stone was the foundation,
Mhm.
but they translate it as a rock.
Because in actuality too, Christ was also considered to be the rock, the stable
More
foundation.
metaphorical.
Correct. And I think this is where some of the confusion comes in. Peter, the rock, Christ, the rock. So which one are we talking about? Well, I think the confession of the faith is actually the more accurate interpretation.
And this really has led to the the structure in the Orthodox Church and across the world, as opposed to putting everything in Rome, where the Catholics, have their structure, and from there, everything emanates. The others were always spread out from the beginning.
Yes, it's a very conciliar structure, as opposed to, as you said, a centralized, not only in Rome, but in a single person.
Right.
And that's where the infallibility of the Pope, that whole doctrine arose, where one person is now determining everything in the church. And the church never really was that centralized. It was always a conciliar structure. And we see that even in the first early church, when there was the controversy over whether Gentiles had to become Jews first and then become Christians. And it was decided by a council in Jerusalem, presided over, by the way, not by Peter of the apostles, but James, the brother of the Lord, who presided over that council. And they decided, no, you do not have to become circumcised and follow Jewish law in order to become a Christian.
That was an argument between Peter and Paul.
Correct. So again, primacy of Peter event, yes, he did speak for the group of 12, and he did have this leadership role and initially. But to say he had the only voice in the church, that is not correct.
And the infallibility just came about in the 1800s.
I think so. I don't know for sure, but someone else has an idea.
Remember Vatican I was, or
Yeah, you're probably right. I think you're right. Yeah.
that's when they,
Which was,
Wrote
I
it
think,
down.
19th century.
Yeah, it was the late 1800s.
Okay.
And,
So-
even then, from what I understand, there was going to be some tempering of the statements on the infallibility of the Pope, but a war broke out. And so Vatican I ended before it was actually finished.
Oh, okay. So what they intended and what actually occurred may have been two different things.
Exactly, yeah, there was some concern of the fact that they had, that you have this very strong statement and there's no tempering put in place to keep it from being as absolute as it was.
Mhm.
And then when some of your earlier questions, is one of the things I dealt with coming over to Orthodoxy is the idea of Rome being totally primary wasn't until like 500 or 600 AD. It was a very slow growth. It took quite a while, but like you said, Rome was always looked up to, but of course Rome was Rome. I mean, it had been, no matter how much it decayed, it was still Rome.
And one of the reasons for the primacy of Pope was because of the imperial city. And so they gave that bishop the honor because it was the seat of the empire. When Constantinople was established, it became the seat of the empire to the extent that it surpassed Rome, but the bishop of Constantinople was never given the primacy that the Roman bishop had.
My understanding is they continued to call themselves Romans all the way up to the 1400s.
Exactly, yes. So the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantine, was actually the Eastern Roman Empire. But going back to Peter, so he was the only disciple who, seeing Jesus walking on the water, we talked about this before, went out to meet him while the others waited for Jesus in the boat. So he always took the initiative. Jesus walking on water, that's you. Tell me to come out there. And, the other disciples they're a little afraid to say that. By the same token, similarly, after Jesus' resurrection, seeing him standing on the shore, Jesus is on the shore actually cooking some fish on a grill. Peter swims out to him while the others get to shore by the boat. And they don't recognize him at first after the resurrection. They're in the boat. And finally, they are looking at him, and John, the Zebedee, says, it's the Lord. and Peter puts a garment around him. They don't show it on this icon, but he's here now. He swims to shore to meet the Lord. And so again, Peter takes the initiative and shows that sort of leadership role. The evangelist Mark tells us how Jesus, on his way to the towns of Caesarea Philippi, began to teach them, the disciples, that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he spoke that saying openly. So Jesus is now starting to tell the disciples, you know, this isn't just end here with me preaching nice things and teaching you about the kingdom of God. They're going to kill me, and I'm going to be rise on the third day. Well, Peter, again, takes the initiative, and he takes Jesus aside. Imagine, has the nerve to take Jesus aside and rebukes him. Says, no, you're not. You're not going to go die and that. And Jesus, when he had turned around, he hears Peter say this, and he turns around and he looks at the rest of the disciples, and he rebukes Peter, saying, "Get thee behind me, Satan, for you're not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." So imagine Jesus rebukes him after he tried to contradict Jesus. And then when Jesus now calls the rest of the multitude to himself, the rest of the multitude doesn't hear Jesus's rebuke to Peter, just the disciples do. But then he calls the people to himself. He says to them, and you'll hear this in today's gospel, by the way, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And then Jesus continues to preach on that subject as well. And we'll hear that in today's gospel. So we see that when Peter begins to dispute with Jesus after taking him aside, Jesus answers him so that the other disciples would hear the rebuke. And why is that? Well, because it's likely that Peter was expressing the general bewilderment of the whole group, which is why all of them had to hear Jesus's sharp response. Because Peter was actually speaking for the group when he says, they're probably all thinking, oh no, don't, you can't go and die. And Jesus makes sure that they all hear the response that, no, you're thinking like men, you're not thinking like God. And then also at the Last Supper, Jesus turns to Peter with the words, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail. And when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. And so these words turn out to be very prophetic. By them, on the one hand, Jesus foretells Peter's denial. On the other, he speaks of Peter's subsequent destiny, specifically that Peter would head the community of the 12 after Jesus's death and resurrection. And already in Jesus' lifetime, Peter was understood to be the most senior of the apostles, which is apparent in all four gospels. So there was no denying that Peter was, in fact, their spokesman. He was the senior representative, and they all were fine with that. There was no controversy. There was no pushback on that.
Was he the oldest too?
No, I think Andrew was older than him. So concerning Peter's denial of Jesus himself. Now, Metropolitan Hilarion does not address this in this volume of the that we're studying. So I'm taking some of this material from other sources. Metropolitan Hilarion actually, it's a 6-volume series. Only 4 are printed in English right now, but he does address Peter's denial in the volume 6 of this series. But someday we'll get to that as well.
You were reading that volume even though it wasn't printed in English.
No, I wish. No, he mentioned that in this volume.
Oh.
He says, I will address this in volume 6 of this series. So when I saw that, I said, well, let me see what I can find in other sources. But so that's why I wanted to talk about Peter's denial, because I think it's important that we look at that as well. So here is Jesus talking to the disciples. This is near the end of his, just before Passion Week, just before his arrest. Okay. And Jesus said to the 12, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. This is actually the night of his arrest. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. Well, here's Peter again. Peter answered, said to him, even if all were made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. All these other guys are gonna leave you, but not me. And Jesus said to him, assuredly I say to you that this night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And still he's still contradicting. He says, well, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And so said all the disciples. Matthew adds that as well. So all the disciples, they're thinking, oh, we'll stick with you to the end, Jesus, even if we have to die. So with great alacrity, Peter alone promises not to stumble. Therefore, Christ permitted him to fall in order to convince him not to be confident in himself, but in God. And also to value Christ's words as more trustworthy than his own knowledge of himself. And I think this is an important interpretation that we should not be confident in ourselves. And even the fathers of the church mentioned that, but trust in God only, and also trust in Christ's words. When he says something, he knows you more than you know yourself. So because Peter's words, though all men stumble and fall, were full of arrogance, Christ shows him to be a braggart who did not know his own weakness. And I think it's interesting to point out that, we have these ideas of these saints as being, great holy men, but they were really people like us, full of our own downfalls and weaknesses, and that Christ kind of shows this to Peter so that he can learn from that. So then Jesus foretells both the hour that it would be this night and how many times he will deny him, which is 3 times. And so Peter, when he says, even if I must die, I will not deny you. Wanting to show that he had genuine love, Peter contradicted the Savior. Now, he had earlier been freed of the fear that he himself might be the betrayer. At the Last Supper, Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. They're all worried. Is it me? Is it me? Is it you? And it turns out to be Judas. So, okay, they're kind of gotten over that fear. And with great love, but also a desire for honor, Peter gets up and he kind of disparages the others and then even opposes Christ at this point.
Why were they all worried that it could be them?
Because he said, one of you will betray me. And they didn't know. And they.
But did they suspect that maybe they had done something that?
Mm-hmm. Because they know Jesus knows, but they don't know. And so they're like, what have I done? Have I done something that I don't know about?
Although Judas probably knew it was him all along.
I think so, yes. Because Judas says, is it I, Lord? And Jesus says to him, you have said so. And then Judas gets up and leaves.
He raises his hand, tells everybody else, it was me.
I mean, pretty much might as well have, because he gets up like from this table and leaves and never comes back.
It's funny, down in the church in Naples, everybody leaves after communion. And the priest said, you're all like Judas.
I bet you that put a stop to that. So all the disciples, even before they had experienced the trials, in ignorance, they made promises that they would not be able to keep. So they all promised, we're going to stick with you, Jesus, not knowing that they're not going to be able to keep that promise. We go to the arrest of Jesus now. And I took from the three gospels, actually from all four, and kind of did a composite of what happened when Jesus was arrested. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Again, Peter is taking a prominent and foremost role here in this, in the arrest. And so Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink of the cup which my Father has given me?" St. Matthew picks up the dialogue. And again, to Peter, "For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot pray to my Father and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus?" And then St. Luke adds this detail, being the physician, and Jesus said, "Permit this even," and Jesus touched the ear of the servant and healed him. And so this is the scene in which Jesus is arrested, and Peter comes along with his sword and right away strikes. Now, Peter was the only one who drew the sword, as St. John said in his gospel, for Peter had a sword, having just recently sacrificed the lamb which they ate for the Passover. Isn't that interesting that we tend to forget that this was the Last Supper was a Passover supper, and the Jews ate lamb, sacrificed a lamb at every Passover. And so Peter had the sword, but, and again, our commentator, St. Theophylact says, "But let's not condemn Peter, for it was not on his own behalf, but for the master that he acted so zealously." And now you can see the icon here, Peter, he's the only one that's got the sword of the disciples. And these are the soldiers that come to arrest Jesus. And that's Judas giving him the kiss of betrayal. But the Lord converts Peter to the evangelic life, lived according to the gospel. He says, "Put away your sword, teaching man not to use the sword, not even when presuming to avenge God." So violence, even in the name of God, is not permitted. Then Christ gives the dictum of the law that he who slays will himself be slain. And this is taken from both Genesis and the prophecy of Jeremiah, where if you live by the sword, you will die by the sword. And so that is what Jesus is teaching. Put away your sword. This is not the time. If I had to, I could call down my own army and defeat these people.
Charlie, does this then speak to conscientious objection?
I think so.
Is this the one they refer to? Oh, there's probably many. I think there's many in the Bible. That
Yeah.
they refer to.
I mean, this is probably one that I think they would use. And now we come to the denial. And this is an icon, a kind of composite of the three denials. Here's the young maiden who accuses him, and that's Peter outside the gate. Says, "Aren't you one of them? One of them? You're a follower of Jesus." "Oh, no, I don't even know him." And then Peter comes in and he warms himself by the fire. And here's number two, the guy pointing to him says, "No, you're one of, I saw you outside with Jesus." And again, Peter's, no way, I don't know him. And then finally, this is the third denial here. Another man accuses him. And I'll pick up the dialogue here with St. Luke's account. But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you're saying. I don't know what you're talking about." Immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter went out and wept bitterly. And you see that in the right side there.
So I always imagined that Jesus was not near to Peter when he did that.
You know, that's true, but I think if we take the account of the St. Luke's gospel, again, this was occurring outside of the home of the high priest, Caiaphas. And so Jesus is facing Caiaphas and Annas, and he's being accused of being the son of God or of whatever they're trying to accuse him of. And so, and and Peter is outside the house. And so, yes, he is in proximity to him. Yeah. But Luke is the only one that mentions that Jesus turns around and looks at Peter at that moment. And so, again, this is one of the commentaries. Peter was so gripped by cowardice to such an extent as this, and was abandoned for a short time by God, because he was overbold, so that when he had been corrected, he might be more forgiving towards others. So Jesus allows him actually to go through this trial in order to for Peter's own benefit. He was so impetuous that if he had not been chastened here, he would have become self-willed, arrogant, and unforgiving toward others. But at this time, Peter was in the grip of such fear that he would not have been aware of his fall if the Lord had not turned and looked at him. And that convicted him to the point where he knew what he had done. I think Peter knew he was denying the Lord. I don't think he realized until he saw the Lord looking at him the extent to which he had betrayed him.
It's like that icon of the face in church.
Yes.
It's always looking at you, no matter where you're sitting.
That's right. So, and now we come to the forgiveness. And then, and again, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? Remember that icon where they're standing, whether they're sitting on the shore, and Jesus is cooking the fish after his resurrection, and Peter swims to him. Well, they have breakfast, the disciples and Jesus. And so that's when he says, so when after they had eaten breakfast, this is the setting that we're talking about here. All the disciples are there, and then Jesus says to Simon Peter, do you love me more than these? And Peter said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my lambs. And he said to him again the second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. And Jesus said to him a third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. And as you said, Susie, 3 denials, 3 confessions of I love you. So without saying I forgive you, he has forgiven you. Okay. St. John Chrysostom, in talking about this, says Jesus spoke on these manners with Peter because he was the chosen one of the apostles, the mouth of the disciples, the leader of the band. And these are Chrysostom's words, not mine. The leader of the band of apostles.
Where
Okay,
did Chrysostom live?
in 390 something. At the same time, Jesus wanted to show Peter that he must now be of good cheer, because the denial was done away, and Jesus put into his hands the chief authority among the brethren. And Jesus brings not forward the denial, nor the reproaches, nor does he reproach him with what had taken place. But he says, if you love me, preside over the brethren, and the warm love which you did ever manifest, and in which you did rejoice, show that now. Okay. And the life which you said you would lay down for me, now give for my sheep. And in fact, Peter did do that. He gave his life when he was martyred in Rome. Okay. Peter says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. This was after the third time he was asked that. And then Chrysostom asks this question, do you see how Peter had become better and more sober, being no more self-willed or contradicting? So remember all those occurrences when Peter was contradicting Christ, rebuking him. Peter's now, he's sobered up. He knows things have changed. For on this account, Peter was troubled. He was asked 3 times, "Do you love me?" Because he's wondering, perchance I think that I love, and maybe I don't. And maybe it's just like I was before when I thought I really loved him and I was going to stand up and I was convicted that I was false. But Jesus said, no. He asked him a 3rd time, and the 3rd time he gives them the same injunction to show at what price Jesus sets the care of his own sheep. And this is especially of a sign of love towards him. So he asked him 3 times in order to reaffirm that you do love me, and this is the price of loving me. So any questions or comments on what we talked about this morning? Okay. Next Sunday, we'll talk about the other apostles. We'll start with James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and their relationship with Christ as well.
It seems that exchange between Peter and Christ seemed like the whole basis for confession. You know, every wrong that Peter did, he had an opportunity to write it, to confess it. And pointed out 3 times here, and in our lifetime, how many times is it when we go to confess? Many times the same guilt, the same sin.
And I want to bring out another point here. Peter, once he realized his betrayal of Christ, he wept bitterly. Judas betrayed Christ, but he did not believe in the forgiveness of Christ. And he went out and killed himself. Because it says in the gospel, he realized what he had done when he saw that they had arrested Jesus and that they were ready to crucify him. He took the 30 pieces of silver, he threw them back at the high priest and said, you know, I've done wrong. But instead of believing in the forgiveness of Christ, he turned away from him completely. And that's the difference between Peter and Judas. That Peter, even though he had betrayed him and denied him, he wept bitterly over his sin, and then he continued to follow Jesus.
I think too, Charlie, when you were pointing out the exact quotes from scripture, that it seemed to me that Jesus was trying to erase his guilt. Erase his guilt because the guilt would not have enabled him to tend the sheep.
Right.
To care for his and carry on. If he were so laden with that guilt. And I think probably that's what we're all supposed to lay down the guilt when we make that confession. But sometimes I think we might carry it still.
Well, I think the priest tries to make that clear that go now, you have been cleansed, you've been rebaptized. And I think he invokes that Nathan the prophet, after he had absolved David of his great sins. This is the same that we should go with a clear conscience, with the knowledge that we've been forgiven and that it's gone, it's erased. No longer carry that burden with you.
As far as the east is from the west.
Right.
Well, it's interesting that the West looks at Peter as like that papacy that we were talking about earlier. And they're more of the judgment mentality, where the Eastern Orthodox are more of the hospital caring mentality. But we have this own dichotomy with Peter, that he has this realization that pre and post, the Lord's death, that we're seeing this.
Yes, and I think that's a good point, John, because Peter was guilty, but his guilt was also a healing. His forgiveness was a healing. But you're right. Once the Western Church got into a scholastic mentality, where there was sin was a crime and forgiveness was the punishment for the crime, the absolution, then it became a real juridical situation, where the Orthodox Church, as you said, it's a healing situation. We are healed of our sins as well as being forgiven. And that healing, then we take, same thing in baptism, we are healed of the evil inclination that infected mankind from the fall. And that healing then, of course, we're human, we still sin, we still fall, but then the confession is a rebaptism where that healing occurs. Just like in physical medicine, if you re-injure yourself, you have the opportunity to heal again. Any other comments or questions? All right, well, thanks everybody for being here. We'll see you next week, God willing.
Oh, 12-4.
What do you really? Can't see it.